Well, good evening and welcome to this literary event, A Bilingual Reading. My name is David Medina. I'm Director of Multicultural Community Relations at Rice University. And before we get started, I would like to thank Jordan Nicholas and Jan West for organizing this event. And now I want to introduce our three presenters. The first one is Gisela Heffes. She is a writer and professor of Latin American literature and culture at Rice University. She is the co-editor of the Latin American Eco-Cultural Reader and the volume of Pushing Past the Human in Latin American Cinema. Her most recent fictions are Sophie Labelle, a bilingual novella with images, and the novel Cocodrilos en la Noche, and the bilingual poetry collection El Cero Móvil de su Boca, the zero mobile of its mouth. Our translator tonight will be Grady Wray. He teaches Latin American literature and Spanish at the University of Oklahoma. He published the first bilingual critical edition of the devotional exercises by Mexico's 17th century exemplary writer Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Recently, he has translated several projects of poetry and fiction from Latin American Southern Cone. He has translated Cocodrilos at Night by Gisela Heffes and also series by Luisa Valenzuela. And our moderator tonight is Denise Kipper. She is a literary translator and a translation scholar. She is also the translation editor at Latin American Literature Today. Her book, Narratives of Mistranslation, Fictional Translators in Latin American Literature, is forthcoming with Routledge. So thank you, and Denise, you're on.
Thank you so much, David, for that introduction, and a shout out to our sponsors, Rice University and Latin American Literature Today. And thank you so much, everyone who has joined us this evening. And it's really such a wonderful opportunity to be able to speak to both a translator and an author at the same time. So I'm very happy to be here with Grady and Gisela. And so just to give you an idea of what the evening will look like, we're going to go through some questions. We're going to do readings from two of the latest books by Gisela. And then at the end, we're going to have some time for the Q&A. So stay with us. And so Gisela, I guess I'm like very impressed by all the things that you do. You are an academic, a very prolific academic at that. You have written several books. You're a poet. You're a novelist, you have several novels to your name as well. So I'm wondering about all these hats that you put on and all these personas that you embody. And so I guess my first question would be, what are the similarities between the Gisela who's a scholar, the Gisela who's a poet, and the Gisela who's a novelist?
Well, thank you so much, Denise. And I want to also kind of take a second to give my thanks to you and to Grady for being here, and also to David Medina for organizing this along with Jordan Nicholas and Jen West. So I'm very, very pleased and very honored. Regarding your question, is a very interesting question, actually, because I feel like my literature and my academic work has been always overlapping. When I was doing research for my dissertation, which was on imaginary cities and utopian cities, I was writing a novel or a novella, which is Sophie Labelle, which takes place, is a kind of like I call it an urban fable, but it's almost like a dystopian novel, you know, very kind of in tune with what's going on today with the ecological crisis. And so I feel like my academic this work and research in so many ways informed who I am, and also kind of determine consciously or unconsciously what I write. Sometimes I make very good, clear decisions to write about something, but sometimes it's there as a background and without even me noticing until much later. So I think that they overlap, and I think they are in conversation in terms of, what I research and what I write. In terms of time, that is much harder, because sometimes to do some work would kind of suck up so much of my time, like my dissertation itself would not allow me to write fiction for a while, because I had to kind of conduct research and write. But other than those kind of challenges, I do feel that that is not like one or the other, but they are one and the other. And I always feel like or maybe I choose to do research on things that in a way I am interested and somehow will have an impact on what I'm going to end up writing. So it could be kind of like the other way around, right?
Yeah, so I guess the flip side to that would be, how are you different? How is Gisela the poet different from Gisela the novelist, for example, right? Do you have a different voice? Do you find that several topics are more easy to explore through prose than through poetry? How do you decide how a project is going to be a short story collection or a novel or a collection of poetry, for example?
Yeah, so I am different and I am the same. Everything comes from the subject. So I was talking to some students from a workshop yesterday, and I was saying like, everything comes from us, from our brain, from our memories, from our interests, from our desires, from our longings, yearnings, everything comes from us. We can try to separate, we can pretend that we are objective and that, you know, that subjectivity doesn't exist, but it's really a try. So I am the same person. I do use a different language. I have to kind of follow certain protocols, right? When I'm writing an academic work, I have to follow certain patterns of writing, which I'm not saying that are the ones that I love the most. I like them, but sometimes I find it a little bit repetitive and less original, and they give you less room to kind of explore your own voice. But I do it because that's something that I decide to do. And when I write fiction, that is kind of the land of freedom, right? And that's what I really enjoy. Like when you're writing fiction, poetry, novels, short stories, it's like a place where you can really explore without thinking or being afraid of what you're saying. I mean, it's also kind of sometimes frightening because that freedom, right, that you have to give yourself as a writer kind of could take you to places that maybe you don't want to go, but you have to also be faithful to yourself and to your voice and go there, even though you may not want to explore that route. So in that sense, it's kind of like different explorations, even though I am the same person. It's kind of like if you are hiking, I don't know, in Utah, or if you are hiking in Connecticut, right? Like, it's going to be the same person, but you're going to be challenged by by a different topology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess, Grady, like a similar question for you. I feel like you're in a very privileged position as a reader of Gisela's work because you are, reading it so closely, right? And, you have translated one of the book of poems that we're going to be talking about today. It's a bilingual poetry collection called El Cero Móvil de su Boca, the mobile zero of its mouth, which came out by Katakana Editores. And then you're also in the process of translating Cocodriles at Night, which is forthcoming with Deep Vellum. So what difference do you see in Gisela as a poet and as a novelist? And how do you navigate those differences or similarities? How is it translating both poetry and prose from the same author?
Well, I think I was really surprised by Gisela as a poet, because I first met Gisela as a novelist and then somewhat as a short story writer. So I was used to her longer fiction first, and I started working with her work after reading the first in her trilogy of novels called Ischia. And she has a trilogy called Ischia, Brussels, and Prague. And I just fell in love with Ischia when I read that novel, which to me was very much an experimental novel that was timeless in the sense of there is no time. She plays with time so well in that novel that everything that happens in that novel could have happened or it could not have happened. Mm-hmm. It is told basically in the conditional tense. And so we never know if this dream that is happening actually is a dream or if it's a reality. It would happen, it might happen. And that just sucked me in when I started translating and reading that first novel that I read of Gisela's. And then I read some of her more short works, which also she plays so well. And I have to say this, especially in Ischia, especially in some of her short works. And this is what I note as a difference between her fiction and her academic work, that in her fiction, I note that she is, as she just said, much more free, and she doesn't have to follow a certain style of academic writing. But in her fiction, I notice that she just does so well with accumulating adjectives and nouns and scenes. There are, in her work, colors are so vibrant, and sounds and smells, and she has a way of describing sounds and smells in such a way that I think really draws the reader in. And she won't just use one adjective or one noun. She will use 5 adjectives or 5 nouns to say something a certain way. And sometimes for a translator, that's difficult because I have to come up with those 5 nouns and those 5 adjectives in English also, which is fun as a translator, but sometimes can be difficult. But I think that's what also sets her apart. And so that Ischia, I started working with Ischia first, and then some of her shorter works. And then all of a sudden, she wrote to me and sent me these poems that she was working on. And I said, Gisela, I'm not used to seeing you as a poet. And when I read her poetry to me was much more precise, much more to the point. It was short lines, almost staccato, but not staccato in a brash way, very succinct, to the point, short lines that said something. Whereas sometimes her fiction tended to go on and on with all of those wonderful adjectives, all of those wonderful nouns, where here she got to the point, she said what she wanted to say, and she said it in a succinct way. And I think sometimes when you translate poetry, because, and luckily the poetry that I've translated, both of Gisela and Marcelo Rioseco, they are using poetry that is not rhymed poetry. It's more free verse. So I don't have to worry about rhyme. But one thing that I think is important when you're translating poetry, even if you are worrying about rhyme or worrying about cadence, is rhythm. And I have to go back to what Edith Grossman has said as a translator of rhymed poetry and poetry in general, is that sometimes the way to get poetry from Spanish to English is to rely on rhythm, because rhythm is something that you can easily or try to get into English from Spanish. And I think Gisela's rhythm in El Cero Móvil de su Boca, the moving zero of its mouth, or the mobile zero of its mouth, there is a certain short, quick rhythm that comes through there that I think is one of the things I would note as a difference between her fiction and her poetry.
Really, that is so wonderful and so moving to hear you speak in such terms about Gisela's work and how amazing it is to see her progression, right? From that very first novel all the way to her last novel that you're currently translating, and the poetry and everything else in between, and how, you know, I can really sense what a fan you are of her work, which is something that is so amazing in that bond that, you know, one you can establish with an author that you're working with, since you're spending so much time with the text, and really you can, you know, you have a very unique perspective, right? As a reader, you might, you know, read all those 5 adjectives and nouns and think like, oh, wow, that's interesting, and then keep on reading. But as a translator, you're probably thinking about that for days, right? And you're rewriting them. And so, you know, you're also an author in a way of Gisela's work as well. And I think that collaboration is very clearly seen in your translation work. And I think that's really amazing, and that's really all you can hope for when you get paired with a translator. So it's really interesting to see the dynamic between you two. And then just moving on more closely to the 2 works we're going to be talking about today. again, I just want to say, 2020 was a horrible year for a lot of people in the entire world, but it was a great year for you, Gisela, because these two books came out in 2020. El Cero Móvil Desboca, The Mobile Zero of Its Mouth, by Katakana, and then Cocodrilos en la Noche came out by Ril Editores in Chile. And so can you maybe talk to us a little bit about the process of writing these books? They came out at the same time, and there's certainly common threads between them, although one is a poetry collection, the other one is a novel. So maybe can you describe these two books and tell us a little bit more about them and how the projects came to be?
Sure, yes. Well, thank you. That's a great question. And they come from very different paths. Cocodrilos is a novel that is about the passing of my father. And it's a novel that I started to write without thinking that it would be a novel when he got sick, and I had to go to Argentina because he was undergoing surgery, a big surgery, like 6 hours long surgery. I was just really like, I had this need of taking notes of what was going on. And I had a notebook where I was taking notes, and I didn't know why I was taking notes, but I had to kind of write it down, my impressions, seeing him as I saw him, going through what he was going, which was really like an ordeal in many, many different senses, and myself, how did I react to that? How my family reacted to that? So I was taking notes, and eventually he had pancreatic cancer, which is a very fast type of cancer. So he died very, very, very soon in March, since I was there in December. So he was not around as much as we wanted him to be around. And we were planning on seeing him. And I could not understand how fast it was. And so it's a novel about him passing away, which is really like a father who dies, which is a very, very transcendental moment for a human being, just because parents are everything to some extent. And then also about being abroad, being in exile, just how do we deal with this? Because I was not there. And every time, I had to work, I had to give classes, I have my children here, everything is here. So it was kind of like all that process that was really taking over my life in all different ways, like listening to WhatsApp messages at 2 a.m. If something happened. So in a way, when he passed away and there was that kind of emptiness, I started to put together those notes and try to bring those messages that we were sending to each other among family members, especially my brother and I. And I started to kind of create the structure of the novel, right? I wasn't first sure how I would set it up and which voice I would use. And I wanted kind of like to talk about this sense of confusion and how hybrid I felt, because I was coming from abroad. What am I? I'm a daughter who lives abroad. I'm the daughter, but I'm a mother. So there were so many things going on in my life when I was experiencing that at the level of as a daughter who's seeing her father like that, but also as a mother who is trying to calm down my kids when they're asking about the grandfather. So like all these different issues came up, and basically that's when I started to work on the novel, and I decided to go in the structure that is this character who is more like a third person, which is also like an autofiction to some extent, and then which is alternated with the notebooks that they're also kind of they're to some extent the notes that I took, but also kind of fictionalized as well. So I explore a little bit that vein, like all the things that I was imagining and all the things that I wanted to say, but that I couldn't say, all my fears. There were moments that I felt coward, just because I couldn't face my father because he was so transformed after the surgery. And that was for me very moving. It was almost traumatic. And then that is one story. And then the story of the poems is completely different. It's almost like it's a book about extinctions to some extent, but written with some joy and some kind of hope. So it's a very weird contrast. And it has been written in a very different context. It was summer. My kids were in summer camp, sleepaway camp, and we were in Montreal just because we like to leave Houston because it's too hot. So we just decided to go to a nice city, which is a beautiful city. And I was working, doing my research, my academic work, but I always need to take breaks because it's too much sometimes. And my breaks will be writing these little poems. And I started to write them without even having a project. I was just like poem number 1, I put like a little title. And then at the end, I realized that I have like 35 poems and I put them together and I just kind of like put it in a Word document. And just like that. And then I came back and for some reason I sent it to Grady. I don't even know why I sent it to Grady. I could have sent it to a press in Spanish, not even thinking about Grady, but for some reason I sent it to Grady and I don't know why. So it just happened. I said, Grady, look, I wrote these poems. And then Grady was like, oh my gosh, you write poetry. I said, I guess.
I love that story. And it seems that, so many things fell into place for these 2 books to appear at the same time, even though they come from so, such different angles, but then just seeing them, both sort of make space for themselves in the world in such a strange year as 2020, then you start making these connections, right? And I feel like, a book of poetry about extinction during a pandemic, I mean, that you couldn't even plan that even if you wanted, right? I think that's amazing. And so with that, I think, should we maybe move to the portion of the reading? I would really like to hear some of the poems. And so we're going to do, Gisela will read the Spanish, and then Grady will read the translation. Does that sound okay? Good.
Sounds great. I'm going to start with the mobile Zero of its mouth, which is the Cero móvil de su boca. I'm going to read the poems in Spanish and then Grady will read them in English. So I'm going to start with Extinciones. Me da pena pensar en lo que queda del verano, lo que queda del mundo. Pienso mucho en lo que queda y en lo que no está. Pienso en las ballenas, en si existirán en el futuro. Pienso en los niños que crecerán estudiando un mundo virtual, niños que conocerán a los glaciares en las imágenes de internet y aprenderán que los osos polares hurgaban en la basura y que los salmones confundidos flotaban en corrientes desatinadas. Sabrán de las algas blancas y del mercurio que yace en el fondo del océano, junto a toneladas de desechos. Niños que habitarán un mundo diferente, una tierra vaciada, pero el verano es diferente. Es un momento de pausa, ir a la playa o a la montaña, llevar a los niños, armar castillos de arena y de regreso el cansancio, dormirse uno sobre el otro, los cachetes rosados de sol, ese sol que queremos pensar benevolente porque nos trae recuerdos de la infancia. Y sin embargo,
Extinctions. It makes me sad to think about what's left of summer, what's left of the world. I think a lot about what's left and what isn't. I think about whales, if they'll exist in the future. I think about children who'll grow up to study a virtual world. Children who will only see glaciers as internet images, who will learn that polar bears dug through trash, and that confused salmon floated in nonsensical currents. They'll know about white algae and about mercury lying at the depths of the ocean next to tons of waste. Children who will inhabit a different world, an emptied earth. But summer is different. It's a moment of pause, to go to the beach or to the mountains, take the kids, build sandcastles, and come back exhausted, fall asleep on top of each other, rosy cheeks from the sun, that sun we want to imagine as benevolent because it reminds us of childhood. And nevertheless.
Otras extinciones. Pienso en mi papá, en su voz que a veces escucho dormida. Me habla entre sueños, me llama. Lo veo sonriendo, me da la mano. Ahora tengo 5 o 6 años. Caminamos por el Rosedal, la avenida Libertador, llena de autos. Las piedritas rojizas en el suelo. Su mano es grande, la mía es chiquita. Hay una fotografía. Tiene un corte de pelo muy años 70 y pantalones amplios. Una camisa con cuello ancho, como si fueran 2 alas de avión a punto de despegar. Es una camisa colorida, naranja y verde, y círculos violáceos que se enroscan como una ola psicodélica. ¿Qué quedó de mi papá? ¿Qué queda de nosotros cuando nos vamos? ¿Nos extinguimos o nos extinguen? Pienso en los objetos, en lo que acumulamos. Los objetos que mi papá coleccionaba fueron casi todos descartados, donados. Algunos los preservamos, mi hermano y yo. Lo demás quedó desperdigado en el espacio, en un paisaje que ya no conocemos. Un sitio habitado por personas que nos son ajenas. Una esfera incalculable que no vemos ni tocamos. Un más allá que nos conecta a través de la materia. Una bufanda o gorra, un llavero, un par de anteojos. Los objetos pierden gravedad, se disuelven, como los cuerpos. Queda la memoria, los recuerdos, las imágenes, imitaciones de fotografías y otras reproducciones mentales, instantáneas que regresan y se pasean entre los días y las noches, los sueños y la vigilia, el presente, el pasado, el futuro.
Other extinctions. I think about my dad, about his voice that I hear sometimes in my sleep. He talks to me between dreams. He calls me. I see him smiling. He gives me his hand. I'm 5 or 6 years old. We walk through Palermo's Rose Garden, Libertador Avenue full of cars. Little reddish rocks on the ground. His hand is big. Mine is small. There's a photo. He has a very 70s haircut and bell bottoms. His shirt has a wide collar, like 2 airplane wings ready to take off. It's a colorful shirt, orange and green with purple circles that twist like psychedelic waves. What's left of my dad? What's left of us when we're gone? We become extinct, or someone makes us extinct. I think about objects, about what we accumulate. The objects my dad collected were almost all discarded, donated. Some we kept, my brother and me. The rest were dispersed in space in a landscape we no longer know, a place inhabited by people who are foreign to us, an incalculable sphere we don't see or touch, somewhere beyond that connects us through matter, a scarf or hat, a keychain, a pair of glasses. Objects lose their gravity. They dissolve like bodies. Memory remains. memories, images, imitations of photos and other mental reproductions, instant ones that come and go. They drift between days and nights, dreams and wakefulness, the present, the past, the future.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And it's so great also to be able to hear a little bit about your father in this collection as well, and sort of the connection between the two works. I'm going to put in the chat the link. If you're interested in purchasing the book, you can do it on the Katakana Editores website. And Grady, I think, I have a question for you, because this was published as a bilingual book, right? And so you have side-to-side original and translation. Was that, or did that present an extra challenge for you, where you got all self-conscious that people were gonna compare your translation to the work? Did that give you, let's say, less freedom to explore, to distance yourself from Gisela's version, or not? How was the process of really having both Spanish and English together on the page?
Well, it is constricting, because if we only knew that people that only were able to read English were going to read this, the English part, then I would feel much freer in my translation. And if I knew that, but because I know so many people know both Spanish and English, and they love to go back and forth, and they like to look at things word for word for word for word. And I know that if that's the case, some people are not going to be satisfied with the translation, because they want to say, well, but that word means this in Spanish. But when you do poetry or any net translation, I personally want to think about the reader who is only an English reader. And so therefore, although there are times, and in fact, I gave this book to a friend of mine who was going to give it to her niece, who was a Spanish major, but is an English speaker, native English speaker, but she was a Spanish major. And I said, now, when you give this to her, you need to let her know that this is not going to be an exact word for word translation of these poems, because I want them to stand alone in English for an English speaker that is not a Spanish reader. And so it can be very constricting, but I tried to let that go. There were a few times where I probably didn't, but I still went ahead and said, okay, I'm not going to worry about what the person is that's going to look at the Spanish and then look across the page and say, but no, there's another word. That's not the right word for this. And no, this is not the word order that you should have done. I had to finally, as I do with all the translations I do, I had to finally leave the Spanish alone and let it go away, and let the English survive on its own as if no one had ever read it in Spanish before. Because I hope that people who may not speak Spanish at all read these poems and enjoy them in English alone.
That is so interesting. And I also think that even for those people who might not have access to the Spanish original, just having it on the page, just seeing the process of translation, right, on the page is still so important. We often complain about how invisibilized translation is, how sometimes translators are not credited on the cover of books, for example. And here you have it so evident that this is a translation, right? So I think it's fascinating, even if your poems are perhaps addressed to people who might not access the Spanish, just having the Spanish there is already doing so much work in terms of recognizing translation within the book. And I think that's amazing. And I guess in order to move to Cocodrilos en la Noche, I am fascinated just, thinking about also El Móvil Cero, the fact that you wrote that while you were in Montreal. And in Cocodrilos en la Noche, there's this trip to Argentina, where you're from, but you are also in Texas. And so just connecting it back to your scholarly work and the fact that you were working with sort of imaginary cities, I guess I wonder, when you have Argentina as a setting or in the background, and with the distance, the physical distance, the geographical distance from which you are writing, how truthful are those cities? Is that really Argentina? Is that the Argentina that used to be your Argentina? Or like, what is your connection, I guess, with your home city, and what is your relationship to the city that is now your home?
Well, actually, very Grady is laughing because there's a poem in the collection. It's called Home. So I don't know if you want me to read it or not, because it kind of answers your question.
Yes.
And I don't know if
Sure,
Grady has
yeah.
the English translation handy, but
Yes, I do. Read it. Yes.
It's just,
Go for
I
it.
mean, I can answer myself, or I can answer with poetry, but this is a poem that is in the collection. It's called Home. Pienso en estar en una ciudad. Pienso en estar en un lugar chiquito, mi guarida, para trabajar y dormir. En lo poco que necesitamos para subsistir. Traje muy pocas ropas, no tengo joyas, compartimos el shampoo y el acondicionador para el pelo. Se puede vivir con tan poco y ser feliz. Se lo digo a mis hijos, se puede ser feliz, aunque nos peleemos, nos amamos. Aunque ellos se burlen de nosotros y nos falten el respeto y seamos lo menos cool. Nos queremos hasta el fondo del cielo, ese cielo decorado por nubes de algodón. Un mes atrás, en California, una mujer me preguntó, "Where's home?" Había notado mi acento. Quiso saber, me reí. Le dije que tengo muchos homes. Home es Buenos Aires, pero también es Houston. Aunque se inunde y las casas floten en el agua. Le dije que mi home es móvil. Mi familia, mis hijos, mi esposo, mi mamá, mi hermano, mis sobrinos, los amigos. Hay muchos homes, le expliqué, no solo uno. Y ahora en esta ciudad magnífica, la ciudad de los yuyos silvestres, de las flores amarillas, la ciudad bilingüe, en que la gente anda en bicicleta, cede el paso y te mira con una sonrisa genuina, también puede ser home, aunque solo sea por 6 semanas. Pienso en lo que es home para otros y me pregunto, ¿no seré una desarraigada?
Home. I think about being in a city. I think about being in a small place, my refuge, to work and sleep. In the small amount we need to survive. I brought very little to wear. I don't have jewelry. We share shampoo and conditioner. You can live with so little and be happy. I tell this to my kids. You can be happy. Although we bicker, we love each other. Although they make fun of us and they don't always respect us and we're not at all cool, we love each other to the farthest reaches of the sky. That sky decorated with cotton clouds. A month ago in California, a woman asked me, "Where is home?" She noticed my accent. She wanted to know. I laughed. I told her I had a lot of homes. Home is Buenos Aires, but it's also Houston, although it floods and the houses float on water. I told her my home is mobile, and it's my family, my children, my husband, my mom, my brother, my nieces and nephews, friends. There are many homes, I explained, not only one. And now, in this magnificent city, the city of wild weeds, of yellow flowers, the bilingual city, where people ride bicycles, yield and look at you with a genuine smile, it can also be home, although only for 6 weeks. I think about what home is for others. I wonder if I might just be rootless.
That is wonderful. And I love how like the poetry can actually speak for you, right? All the answers are contained in your work. That's amazing. I see that we already have a question in the Q&A, and for those who are watching this, below on Zoom, you should see a Q&A icon. So feel free to place your questions there or write them on the chat. So perhaps we can do a few questions and then devote the last few minutes to the reading of Cockadrails at Night. The question is from Barry Olet. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Says, Gisela, it seems like COVID and the changes to the world and your kids' world impacted you. Could you talk more about this? I found that interesting. Thank you.
Could you repeat the last part of the question? I couldn't hear.
Yes, how COVID impacted you. Could you talk about more of this? I found that interesting. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for listening and for asking that question. I think COVID impact everyone in so many different ways. It's impossible not to be impacted by what happened and was still kind of happening. So in particular, for me, it was being home, like most women that have jobs and have kids had to kind of juggle with family in the house and working in the house. So that was kind of a difficult situation in many ways. But on the other hand, I got to do things for fun with my family. Like I remember with the first moment that COVID hit the world, and my son ended school very early just because it was a kind of readjustment for the school and everything, and teachers that were very old having to do Zoom classes. Everything was kind of like in transition. I just remember going biking with him, and that was so nice. I missed that, you know. So there were some certain things that, in spite of the ugliness and in spite of all the people that unfortunately are not here anymore, I think everybody experienced in different ways, and also trying to see the good things that you can get to do in those dire circumstances is great. So those are good memories. And writing wise, I wrote a lot, but I feel like there were so many people writing at the same time and so many people publishing at the same time that I was wondering how premature it would be to write or publish about something that maybe you need to kind of internalize and digest a little bit. So writing wise, I kind of waited. I only published like one story, and one of my friends read it and she didn't like it. She said, "Oh, that story is terrible. Why did you publish that?" So I said, okay, I should wait. I should not be like trying to publish like everybody else. And so then I decided to kind of, you know, like maybe like pieces that were more like a reflection or like an opinion, but not like fiction or poetry. And I did not move forward after that.
Yeah, no, I feel like we're still processing everything that happened, right? And we still need to think through a lot of the things.
Absolutely. Internalizing, right? Like we
Yeah.
need to kind of wait a tiny bit. Yeah.
Yeah. I see there's another question from David Medina on the chat. When Mario Vargas Llosa gave a talk at Rice several years ago, he said that poetry was the highest level of writing. He said he couldn't do it, and that's why he turned to fiction. Which do you find more difficult to write, fiction or poetry?
It's a tricky question. I see Grady smiling because I kind of like find myself being a poet writing prose. So it's in a way like to kind of come up with a set of poems. In a way, it was surprising, but not that surprising. My prose has a lot of musicality, has a lot of rhythm, has a lot of devices that you would use in like literary devices that you would use in poetry. So I do think that my prose is not too far away from poetry. But I again, when I wrote those poems, I wasn't planning, so I can't really talk like someone who said, okay, this is my goal. this is my opportunity. This is my project. I'm going to write, a book of poetry. This was really, I would say, spontaneous. That's the word. Very spontaneous. And sometimes good things happen when you are spontaneous. Sometimes, it's that kind of like need to express something that you have, that you let it go. You just do it. You're not afraid, oh, I'm not a poet. What am I doing? Just do it, and then you see what happens. And if it's bad, you can always put it in a little file and just kind of like bury it, somewhere. But don't repress that voice that wants to get out and wants to tell something, because sometimes that's what happens. And it's more the voice and the need to tell something, no matter how, than the genre itself, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And we have another question from Arthur Dixon. He says, how has it been working with presses like Katakana Editores and Vellum? And congratulations to both of you on your great work.
Well, maybe Grady, do you want to talk about Katakana, because you were the one who really had the connection with Omar, and you came up really fast with this idea, right? So,
well, with Katakana, it was extremely easy and quick to work with. As we said earlier, the whole publication process of the mobile zero of its mouth just kind of fell in our lap. I happen to know that Omar who's the editor of Katakana. I ran into him, or was going to, before the pandemic, in fact, was going to see him in Mexico, and then and sent him what we had worked on. Gisela had sent me, and I sent to him and said, here's something that I think would be great to publish in a bilingual way. And he got back to me immediately and answered emails immediately, and I sent him things, and he did it really, really quickly, which is something that I hadn't really had before. So I appreciate Katakana greatly for doing this so quickly, and for working with us too at the very last minute to make our final changes and to get everything done with the final proofs of the book. It was really a dream to work with him, and we're just now starting to work with Deep Vellum, so I haven't had to send anything to them yet. But so I can't really answer yet about Deep Vellum. I'm just thrilled that we're going to work with Deep Vellum, because I think what they have done as far as in translations of great works in many different languages is great. And I'm very happy that they have taken on Gisela's work and my translation of her work.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are two great presses. Deep Vellum has a history of doing a lot of work in translation, like you say, Grady, from different languages. And Katakana is a newer press, but has done so much work already, sort of amplifying Latin American voices in the US, specifically Latin American writers who are in the US, and that's really commendable. And it's a great project, and they have been putting out really great titles. I think so. That's it for questions for now, which is great because we're actually running out of time. But something that you said, Gisela, earlier, referring to David's question on the chat about how your fiction is close to your poetry. And Grady, when you started talking about Gisela's work and you referred back to her first novel, Ischia, and this feeling of, not knowing if it was happening, if it was going to happen, I'm just fascinated by how these two things sort of appear in Cocodrilos en la Noche and Cocodrilos at Night, because in a way, it is written in like shorter vignettes that are very lyrical, and also it is very blurring in the limits and boundaries between reality and fiction, right? And you have this protagonist that may or may not be you, that may or may not have your name, right? So I think, you can see all these things that were present previously in your work that have informed your work before, sort of come to full form in this novel. And I'm really looking forward to the publication of this book next year. Again, it's coming out with the Vellum in early 2022. And I'm especially excited because at Latin American Literature Today, we are going to publish an excerpt in our February issue. So stay tuned for that. And with that, should we hear some from the novel then?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Denise. I'm gonna read the first pages of the novel. Hoy murió papá. Estaba previsto, pero yo no lo vi. No pude predecirlo. No pude adivinar el día de su partida. Me tomó por sorpresa en Disney World. No soy un oráculo. Estaba en uno de los coches de Tomorrowland con mi suegro y mis 2 hijos. Empujada por los rieles de los coches que van de un futuro a otro, con los altoparlantes exclamando aventuras, desafíos e innovaciones, recibí la llamada. Mi hermano me habló desde Barajas. Se acababa de subir al avión. Disney World, el mundo de los sueños, hecho realidad. No pudo verlo, ni yo. Y de las pesadillas, ¿qué dirá Mr. Disney? Cuaderno de notas. Hagamos de cuenta que el aeropuerto del que parte la protagonista no es el Bush Intercontinental de la ciudad de Houston, sino el Aeropuerto Internacional de Orlando. Que la compañía aérea en la que viaja no es United, ex-Continental, sino American Airlines. Que la protagonista de esta novela no se llama Gisela, sino Vera. Que su apellido no es Gerenstein, sino Heffes, Vera Heffes. Pero hagamos de cuenta que las dos tienen algo en común, un padre que está a punto de ser intervenido quirúrgicamente. Arribos. Vera, o mejor dicho, el avión en el que viajaba Vera, aterrizó un martes por la mañana, 5 minutos antes que el avión en el que llegaba su hermano, su esposa y sus 3 hijos. Vera vio el avión de Air France aterrizar desde su propia ventanita ovalada. No vio a su hermano, pero lo imaginó en el asiento, mirando hacia afuera o en dirección del pasillo, donde azafatas que hablaban francés revisaban que todo estuviera en orden. Los asientos erguidos, los cinturones de seguridad abrochados, los bolsos y las valijas bajo el asiento opuesto en los compartimentos superiores. Imaginó a su hermano pensando en ella y en su papá, el papá que compartían y que aguardaba en el sanatorio a que sus hijos llegaran y lo besaran en la frente. Cuaderno de notas. Pero quizá la que se levantaba de su asiento y miraba a sus ex compatriotas con una mezcla de curiosidad y extrañeza fuera una tercera persona. Una invención, un híbrido, una nueva entidad, consecuencia directa de su estadía en el exterior por más de una década. Esa entidad que llamamos Vera, pero podría ser Gisela, cerró su cuaderno de notas amarillo y lo acomodó en su mochila con cuidado. Hubiera querido escribir más, describir el momento preciso en que recibió la llamada, describir su reacción, anotar con precisión cómo imaginó a su padre entrando al sanatorio, la sala de emergencias, el color de su piel, el día de su cumpleaños. Cuaderno de notas. Le hubiera gustado escribir mucho más. Describir, por ejemplo, la escena que, al entrar en una habitación velada, encontrara a su padre recostado, el silencio o la solemnidad que lo rodeaba. No estaba asustado, estaba derrotado. Pero ella no lo supo entonces, lo entendió después, mucho más tarde. Lo más probable es que se hubiera detenido en describir su sonrisa, cómo esa sonrisa se transformaba en espera y cómo en la espera se inyectaba el miedo. ¿Qué habrá sentido en ese momento cuando sus ojos se encontraron con los suyos? Eso también hubiera querido trabajar en su cuaderno de notas.
Dad died today. It was expected, but I didn't expect it. I couldn't predict it. I couldn't guess the day of his departure. It took me by surprise in Disney World. I'm not an oracle. I was on one of those rides in Tomorrowland with my father-in-law and my 2 kids, pushed along on the rails in cars that go from one future to another, with speakers blaring about adventures, challenges, and innovations. I got the call. My brother called me from the Barajas airport in Madrid. He had just boarded the plane. Disney World, the world where dreams come true. I didn't see it coming, not even me. What about nightmares? What would Mr. Disney say about nightmares? Notebook. Let's pretend like this story's main character does not depart from Houston's Bush Intercontinental Airport, but Orlando's International Airport. The airline she's flying is not United, previously Continental, but American Airlines. The main character of this novel is not Gisela, but Vera. Her last name is not Gerenstein, but Heffes. Vera Heffes. But let's pretend like they both have something in common. A father who is about to have surgery. Arrivals. Vera, or we should say the plane that was carrying Vera, landed on Tuesday morning, 5 minutes before the plane that was carrying her brother, his wife, and their 3 kids. Vera saw the Air France plane land from her little oval-shaped window. She didn't see her brother, but she imagined him in his seat, looking out the window or down the aisle where the French-speaking flight attendants made sure everything was ready. Seat backs in their full and upright positions, seat belts fastened, all carry-on items and suitcases stowed under the seat in front of him or in the overhead compartments. She imagined her brother, thinking about her and her father, the father they shared and who was waiting at the hospital for his children to arrive and kiss him on his forehead. Notebook. But perhaps the woman who got up from her seat and looked around at her former compatriots with a mixture of curiosity and strangeness was actually a third person, an invention, a hybrid, a new entity, a direct consequence of living out of the country for more than a decade. This entity that we'll call Vera, but who could be Gisela, closed her yellow notebook and carefully returned it to her backpack. She would have wanted to write more, to describe the precise moment that she got the call, to describe her reaction, to precisely write down how she imagined her father entering the hospital, the emergency room, the color of his skin on his birthday. Notebook. She would have liked to have written a lot more. For example, to describe the scene where, when she entered the hospital room, she found her father lying in his bed. The silence or solemnity that surrounded him. He wasn't afraid. He was defeated. But she didn't know that then. She understood afterwards, much later. She probably stopped writing as she described his smile, how that smile turned into waiting, and how that waiting injected him with fear. What might she have felt at that moment when her eyes met his? She would have liked to have worked that out in her notebook.
That was wonderful and so moving. Thank you so much. It has been my absolute pleasure to be in conversation with you both. Thank you so much for everyone who has joined tonight. And thank you, David, Jordan, and Jan for organizing, to Rice University and Latin American Literature Today for sponsoring this event. And I really look forward to reading more from both of you. And 2022 is going to be a great year as well. So yeah, thank you so much for everything. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Denise, so much. I am so happy and pleased. And thank you, Grady, as always, for your hard work. I just want to say like a side note, because you guys were talking about translators before and the amazing work that translators do. And I just want to say that I am the type of person that would advocate to have the translator name in the front cover of the book, because I do think that it's not word by word. It's just getting into the story. It's such an amazing work what is done, and it's not really valued in all in its scale, and it's almost like a work in its own. And sometimes, as you guys both know, like translators improve so much certain works, like a translator can be magical, can turn something that is okay into wonderful. So that's kind of like a side note, but I think like has to be said.
No, thank you so much for adding that. And I think that can really only be achieved with authors' support, and for authors, authors who champion translation and who understand really what translation is. So I really appreciate that.
Let me just say too that it's a big step for Gisela, or especially living authors, to trust a translator. And so the trust that Gisela has put into me, I appreciate it greatly, because I have always loved her work, and that she allows me to try to get it to English, to an English-speaking audience, is an honor for me. And I'm really happy that she's allowed me to do that. And as she said, sometimes, and we always say this, that sometimes things are lost in translation. And I think that's true. Sometimes we do lose things in translation. But I do want to say that sometimes we find things in translation also. And what we may have lost in one part of a translation, we find in another part. And its trick in English, sometimes there are English phrases that come through that wouldn't have been in the Spanish, as there are Spanish phrases that we just can't do into English. So a translation takes on a life of its own, and sometimes things are found, although certain things are lost.
Gained in translation.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for everything, and good night, and looking forward to reading the translation next year. Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.